Preface, Introduction, and Chapter 1 of Cocoa and Chocolate, Their History from Plantation to Consumer, by Arthur W. Knapp. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Allison Hester of Athens, Georgia. Cocoa and Chocolate, Their History from Plantation to Consumer, by Arthur W. Knapp. Preface. Although there are several excellent scientific works dealing in a detailed manner with the cacao bean and its products from the various viewpoints of the technician, there is no comprehensive modern work written for the general reader. Until that appears, I offer this little book, which attempts to cover lightly but accurately the whole ground, including the history of cacao, its cultivation and manufacture. This is a small book in which to treat of so large a subject, and to avoid prolixity I have had to generalize. This is a dangerous practice, for what is gained in brevity is too often lost in accuracy. Brevity may be always the soul of wit. It is rarely the body of truth. The expert will find that I have considered him in that I have given attention to recent developments, and if I have talked of the methods peculiar to one place as though they applied to the whole world, I ask him to consider me by supplying the inevitable variations and exceptions himself. The book, though short, has taken me a long time to write, having been written in the brief breathing spaces of a busy life, and it would never have been completed but for the encouragement I received from Messrs. Cadbury Brothers, who aided me in every way. I am particularly indebted to the present Lord Mayor of Birmingham, Mr. W. A. Cadbury, for advice and criticism, and to Mr. Walter Barrow for the reading proofs. The members of the staff to whom I am indebted are Mr. W. Pickard, Mr. E. J. Organ, Mr. T. B. Rogers. Also Mr. A. Hackett, for whom the diagrams in the manufacturing section were originally made by Mr. J. W. Richards. I am grateful to Messrs. J. S. Fry and Sons, Limited, for information and photographs. In one or two cases I do not know whom to thank for the photographs, which have been culled from many sources. I have much pleasure in thanking the following: Mr. R. Whymper for a large number of Trinidad photos, the director of the Imperial Institute, and Mr. John Murray for permission to use 3 illustrations from the Imperial Institute series of handbooks to the commercial resources of the tropics. Mr. Ed Laplay, Director General of Agriculture, Belgium, for several photos, the blocks of which were kindly supplied by Mr. Hamel Smith of Tropical Life, Messrs. Macmillan and Company, for 5 reproductions from C. J. J. Van Hall's book on cocoa and West Africa, for 4 illustrations of the Gold Coast. The industry with which this book deals is changing slowly from an art to a science. It is in a transition period. It is one of the humors of any live industry that is always in a transition period. There are many indications of scientific progress in cacao cultivation, and now that, in addition to the experimental and research departments attached to the principal firms, a research association has also been formed for the cocoa and chocolate industry, the increased amount of diffused scientific knowledge of cocoa and chocolate manufacture should give rise to interesting developments. A. W. Knapp, Birmingham, February, 1920. End of preface. Introduction. In a few short chapters I propose to give a plain account of the production of cocoa and chocolate. I assume that the reader is not a specialist and knows little or nothing of the subject, and hence both the style of writing and the treatment of the subject will be simple. At the same time, I assume that the reader desires a full and accurate account, and not a vague story in which the difficulties are ignored. I hope that, as a result of this method of dealing with my subject, even experts will find much in the book that is of interest and value. After a brief survey of the history of cocoa and chocolate, I shall begin with the growing of the cacao bean, and follow the cacao in its career until it becomes the finished product ready for consumption. Cacao or cocoa. The reader will have noted above the spelling cacao, and to those who think it curious, I would say that I do not use this spelling from pedantry. It is an imitation of the word which the Mexicans used for this commodity as early as 1500, and when spoken by Europeans is apt to sound like the howl of a dog. The Mexicans called this tree from which cacao is obtained cocoalt. When the great Swedish scientist Linnaeus, the father of botany, was named and classifying, about 1735, the trees and plants known in his time, he christened it Theobroma cacao, by which name it is called by botanists to this day. Theobroma is Greek for food of the gods. Why Linnaeus paid this extraordinary compliment to cacao is obscure, but it has been suggested that he was inordinately fond of the beverage prepared from it, the cup which both cheers and satisfies. It will be seen from the above that the species name is cacao, and one can understand that Englishmen, finding it difficult to get their insular lips around this outlandish word, lazily called it cocoa. In this book I shall use the words cacao, cocoa, and chocolate as follows. Cacao. When I refer to the cacao tree, the cacao pod, or the cacao bean or seed. By the single word cacao, I imply the raw product, cacao beans, in bulk. Cocoa, when I refer to the powder manufactured from the roasted bean by pressing out part of the butter. The word is too well established to be changed, even if one wished it. As we shall see later, in the chapter on adulteration, it has come legally to have a very definite significance. If this method of distinguishing between cacao and cocoa were the accepted practice, the perturbation which occurred in the public mind during the war in 1916 as to whether manufacturers were exporting cocoa to neutral countries would not have arisen. It should have been spelled cacao, for the statements referred to the raw beans and not to the manufactured beverage. Had this been done, it would have been unnecessary for the manufacturers to point out that cocoa powder was not being so exported, and that they naturally did not sell the raw cacao bean. Chocolate. This word is given a somewhat wider meaning. It signifies any preparation of roasted cacao beans without abstraction of butter. It practically always contains sugar and added cacao butter, and is generally prepared in molded form. It is used either for eating or drinking. Cacao beans and coconuts. In old manuscripts, the word cacao is spelled in all manner of ways, but cocoa survived them all. This curious inversion, cocoa, is to be regretted, for it has led to a confusion which could not otherwise have arisen. But for this spelling no one would have dreamed of confusing the totally unrelated bodies, cacao and the milky coconut. Footnote: you note that I spell it coconut, not cocoanut, for the name is derived from the Spanish coco, grinning face, or bugbear for frightening children, and was given to the nut because the 3 scars at the broad end of the nut resemble a grotesque face. End of footnote. To make confusion worse confounded, the old writers referred to cacao seeds as cacao nuts. Footnote: as for example, in the humble memorial of Joseph Fry, quoted in the chapter on history. End of footnote. But as in appearance cacao seeds resemble beans, they are now usually spoken of as beans. The distinction between cacao and the coconut may be summarized thus: botanical name of cacao, Theobroma cacao tree. Botanical name of coconut, Cocos nucifera palm. The fruit of cacao. Cacao pod, containing many seeds, cacao beans. The fruit of a coconut, coconut, which, with outer fiber, is as large as a man's head. Products of cacao. Cocoa, chocolate. Products of coconut. Broken coconut, copra. Coconut matting. Fatty constituent of cacao. Cacao butter. Fatty constituent of coconut, coconut oil. End of introduction. Chapter 1. Cocoa and Chocolate, a sketch of their history. Quote, "Did time and space allow, there is much to be told on the romantic side of chocolate, of its divine origin, of the bloody wars and brave exploits of the Spaniards who conquered Mexico and were the first to introduce cacao into Europe, tales almost too thrilling to be believed, of the intrigues of the Spanish court, and of celebrities who met and sipped their chocolate in the parlors of the coffee and chocolate houses so fashionable in the 17th and 18th centuries." Quoted from Cocoa and Chocolate, Whymper. On opening a cacao pod, it is seen to be full of beans surrounded by a fruity pulp, and whilst the pulp is very pleasant to taste, the beans themselves are uninviting, so that doubtless the beans were always thrown away until someone tried roasting them. One pictures this someone as a prehistoric Aztec with swart skin sniffing the aromatic fume coming from the roasting beans, and thinking that beans which smelled so appetizing must be good to consume. The name of the man who discovered this use of cacao must be written in some early chapter of the history of man, but it is blurred and unreadable. All we know is that he was an inhabitant of the New World, and probably of Central America. Original home of cacao. The corner of the earth where the cacao tree originally grew, and still grows wild today, is the country watered by the mighty Amazon and the Orinoco. This is the very region in which Orellano, the Spanish adventurer, said that he had truly seen El Dorado, which he describes as a city of gold, roofed with gold, and standing by a lake with golden sands. In reality, El Dorado was nothing but a vision that for 100 years fascinated all manner of dreamers and adventurers from Sir Walter Raleigh downwards, so that many braved great hardships in search of it, groped through forests where the cacao tree grew, and returned to Europe feeling they had failed. To our eyes they were not entirely unsuccessful, for whilst they failed to find a city of gold, they discovered the home of the golden pod. Montezuma, the first great patron of chocolate. When Columbus discovered the New World, he brought back with him to Europe many new and curious things, one of which was cacao. Some years later, in 1519, the Spanish conquistador Cortez landed in Mexico, marched into the interior, and discovered, to his surprise, not the huts of savages, but a beautiful city with palaces and museums. This city was the capital of the Aztecs, a remarkable people, notable alike for their ancient civilization and their wealth. Their national drink was chocolate, and Montezuma, their emperor, who lived in a state of luxurious magnificence, "took no other beverage than the chocolatl, a potation of chocolate, flavored with vanilla and other spices, and so prepared as to be reduced to a froth of the consistency of honey, which gradually dissolved in the mouth and was taken cold. This beverage, if it so could be called, was served in golden goblets, with spoons of the same metal or tortoise shell finely wrought. The emperor was exceedingly fond of it, to judge from the quantity, no less than 50 jars or pitchers being prepared for his own daily consumption. 2,000 more were allowed for that of his household. It is curious that Montezuma took no other beverage than chocolate, especially if it be true that the Aztecs also invented that fascinating drink, the cocktail. How long this ancient people, students of the mysteries of culinary science, had known the art of preparing a drink from cacao is not known, but it is evident that the cultivation of cacao received great attention in these parts, for if we read down the list of tributes paid by different cities to the lords of Mexico, we find 20 chests of ground chocolate, 20 bags of gold dust, again 80 loads of red chocolate, 20 lip jewels of clear amber, and yet again 200 loads of chocolate. Another people that share with the Aztecs the honor of being the first great cultivators of cacao are the Incas of Peru, that wonderful nation that knew not poverty. The fascination of chocolate. That chocolate charmed the ladies of Mexico in the 17th century, even as it charms the ladies of England to-day, is shown by a story which Gage relates in his New Survey of the West Indias, 1648. He tells us that at Chiapa, southward from Mexico, the women used to interrupt both sermon and mass by having their maids bring them a cup of hot chocolate. And when the bishop, after fair warning, excommunicated them for this presumption, they changed their church. The bishop, he adds, was poisoned for his pains. Cacao beans as money. Cacao was used by the Aztecs not only for the preparation of a beverage, but also as a circulating medium of exchange. For example, one could purchase a tolerably good slave for 100 beans. We read that their currency consisted of transparent quills of gold dust, and bits of tin cut in the form of a T, and of bags of cacao containing a specified number of grains. "Blessed money!" exclaims Peter Martyr, "which exempts its possessor from avarice, since it cannot be long hoarded, nor hidden underground." Derivation of chocolate. The word was derived from the Mexican chocolatl. The Mexicans used to froth their chocolatl with curious whisks made specially for the purpose. Thomas Gage suggested that choco, choco, choco is a vocal representation of the sound made by stirring chocolate. The suffix atl means water. According to Mr. W. J. Gordon, we owe the name of chocolate to a misprint. He states that Joseph Acosta, who wrote as early as 1604 of chocolatl, was made by the printer to write chocolate, from which the English eliminate the accent, and the French the final letter. First cacao in Europe. The Spanish discoverers of the New World brought home to Spain quantities of cacao, which the curious tasted. We may conclude that they drank the preparation cold, as Montezuma did, hot chocolate being a later invention. The new drink, eagerly sought by some, did not meet with universal approval, and, as was natural, the most diverse opinions existed as to the pleasantness and wholesomeness of the beverage when it was first known. Thus Joseph Acosta, 1604, wrote, "The chief use of this cocoa is in a drink which they call chacholate, whereof they make great account, foolishly and without reason, for it is loathsome to such as are not acquainted with it, having a cream or froth that is very unpleasant to taste, if they be not well conceited thereof. Yet it is a drink very much esteemed among the Indians, whereof they feast noble men as they pass through their country. The Spaniards, both men and women, that are accustomed to the country, are very greedy of this chacholate." It is not impossible that the English, with the defeat of the Armada fresh in memory, were at first contemptuous of this Spanish drink. Certain it is that when British sea rovers, like Drake and Frobisher, captured Spanish galleons on the high sea, and on searching their holds for treasure, found bags of cacao, they flung them overboard in scorn. In considering this scorn of cacao, shown alike by British buccaneers and Dutch corsairs, together with the critical air of Joseph Acosta, we should remember that the original chocolatl of the Mexicans consisted of a mixture of maize and cacao, with hot spices like chilies, and contained no sugar. In this condition few inhabitants of the temperate zone could relish it. It, however, only needed one thing, the addition of sugar, and the introduction of this marked the beginning of its European popularity. The Spaniards were the first to manufacture and drink chocolate in any quantity. To this day they serve it in the old style, thick as porridge and pungent with spices. They endeavored to keep secret the method of preparation, and without success, to retain the manufacture as a monopoly. Chocolate was introduced into Italy by Carletti, who praised it and spread the method of its manufacture abroad. The new drink was introduced by monks from Spain into Germany and France, and when in 1660 Maria Theresa, Infanta of Spain, married Louis XIV, she made chocolate well known at the court of France. She it was of whom a French historian wrote that Maria Theresa had only two passions, the king and chocolate. Chocolate was advocated by the learned physicians of those times as a cure for many diseases, and it was stated that Cardinal Richelieu had been cured of general atrophy by its use. From France the use of chocolate spread into England, where it began to be drunk as a luxury by the aristocracy, about the time of the Commonwealth. It must have made some progress in public favor by 1673, for in that year a lover of his country wrote in the Harleian Miscellany demanding its prohibition, along with brandy, rum, and tea, on the ground that this imported article did no good and hindered the consumption of English-grown barley and wheat. New things appeal to the imaginative, and the absence of authentic knowledge concerning them allows free play to the imagination. So it happened that in the early days, whilst many writers vied with one another in writing glowing panegyrics on cacao, a few thought it an evil thing. Thus, whilst it was praised by many for its wonderful faculty of quenching thirst, allaying hectic heats, of nourishing and fattening the body, it was seriously condemned by others as an inflamer of the passions. Chocolate houses and clubs. The drinking here of chocolate can make a fool a Sophie. In the spacious days of Queen Elizabeth, tea, coffee, and chocolate were unknown save to travellers and savants, and the handmaidens of the good queen drank beer with their breakfast. When Shakespeare and Ben Jonson foregathered at the Mermaid Tavern, their winged words passed over tankards of ale, but later other drinks became the usual accompaniment of news, story, and discussion. In the 1660s there were no strident newspapers to destroy one's equanimity, and the gossip of the day began to be circulated and discussed over cups of tea, coffee, or chocolate. The humorists, ever stirred by novelty, tilted, pen in hand, at these new drinks. Thus one rhymester described coffee as, quote, "syrup of soot, or essence of old shoes." End quote. The first coffee house in London was started in St. Michael's Alley, Cornhill, in 1652, when coffee was 7 shillings a pound. The first tea house was opened in Exchange Alley in 1657, when tea was 5 sovereigns a pound, and in the same year, with chocolate about 10 to 15 shillings per pound, a Frenchman opened the first chocolate house in Queen's Head Alley, Bishopsgate Street. The rising popularity of chocolate led to the starting of more of these chocolate houses, at which one could sit and sip chocolate, or purchase the commodity for preparation at home. Pepys' entry in his diary for 24th November 1664 contains, quote, to a coffee house to drink chocolate, very good." End quote. It is an artless entry, and yet one can almost hear him smacking his lips. Silbermann says that, "After the Restoration there were shops in London for the sale of chocolate at 10 shillings or 15 shillings per pound. Ozinda's chocolate house was full of aristocratic consumers. Comedies, satirical essays, memoirs, and private letters of that age frequently mention it. The habit of using chocolate was deemed a token of elegant and fashionable taste, and while the charms of this beverage in the reigns of Queen Anne and George I were so highly esteemed by courtiers, by lords and ladies and fine gentlemen in the polite world, the learned physicians extolled its medicinal virtues." End quote. From the coffee house and its more aristocratic relative, the chocolate house, there developed a new feature in English social life, the club. As the years passed, the chocolate house remained a rendezvous, but the character of its habitués changed from time to time. Thus one, famous in the days of Queen Anne, and well known by its sign of the cocoa tree, was at first the headquarters of the Jacobite party, and the resort of Tories of the strictest school. It became later a noted gambling house, and ultimately developed into a literary club, including amongst its members Gibbon, the historian, and Byron, the poet. Tax on cacao. The growing consumption of chocolate did not escape the all-seeing eye of the chancellors of England. As early as 1660 we find amongst various custom and excise duties granted to Charles II, "For every gallon of chocolate, sherbet, and tea made and sold, to be paid by the maker thereof, 8d." Later the raw material was also made a source of revenue. In the humble memorial of Joseph Fry, of Bristol, maker of chocolate, which was addressed to the Lords Commissioners of the Treasury in 1776, we read that "chocolate pays 2 shillings and 3 pence per pound excise, besides about 10 shillings per hundredweight on the cocoa nuts from which it is made." In 1784 a preferential customs rate was proposed in favor of our colonies. This they enjoyed for many years before 1853, when the uniform rate, until recently in force, was introduced. This restrictive tariff on foreign growths rose in 1803 to 5s. 10d. per pound, against 1s. 10d. on cacao grown in British possessions. From this date it gradually diminished. High duties hampered for many years the sale of cocoa, tea, and coffee, but in recent times these duties have been brought down to more reasonable figures. For many years before 1915 the import duty was 1d. per pound on the raw cacao beans, 1d. per pound on cacao butter, and 2s. a hundredweight, less than a farthing a pound, on cacao shells or husks. In the budget of September, 1915, the above duties were increased by 50%. A further and greater increase was made in the budget of April, 1916, when cacao was made to pay a higher tax in Britain than any other country in the world. In 1919 imperial preference was introduced after a break of over 60 years, the duty on cocoa from foreign countries being 3/4d. a pound more than that from British possessions. Duty on cacao, 1855 to 1915. Cacao beans per pound, 1d. Cacao butter per pound, 1d. Cacao shells per hundredweight, 2s. In 1915, cacao beans per pound, 1½ Cacao butter per pound, 1½ Cacao shells per hundredweight, 3s. In 1916, cacao beans per pound, 6d. Cacao butter per pound, 6d. Cacao shells per hundredweight, 12s. In 1919, cacao beans per pound, 4½ foreign, 3¾ British. Cacao butter per pound, 4½ foreign, 3¾ British. Cacao shells per hundredweight, 6s. foreign, 5s. British. In considering this duty and its effect on the price of the finished article, it should be remembered that there are substantial losses in manufacture. Thus the beans are cleaned, which removes up to 0.5 per cent. Roasted, which causes a loss by volatilization of 7 per cent., and shelled, the husks being about 12 per cent. Therefore the actual yield of usable nib, which has to bear the whole duty, is about 80 per cent. It may be well to add that the yield of cocoa powder is 48 per cent. Of the raw beans, or roughly 1 pound of the raw product yields half a pound of the finished article. Introduction of cocoa powder. The drink cocoa, as we know it today, was not introduced until 1828. Before this time the ground bean, mixed with sugar, was sold in cakes. The beverage prepared from these chocolate cakes was very rich in butter, and whilst the British Navy has always consumed it in this condition, the sailors generally remove with a spoon the excess of butter which floats to the top. It is a little heavy for less hearty digestions. Van Houten, of the well-known Dutch house of that name, in 1828 invented a method of pressing out part of the butter, and thus obtained a lighter, more appetizing, and more easily assimilated preparation. As the butter is useful in chocolate manufacture, this process enabled the manufacturer to produce a less costly cocoa powder, and thus the circle of consumers was widened. Messrs. Cadbury Brothers of Birmingham first sold their cocoa essence in 1866, and Messrs. Fry and Sons of Bristol introduced a pure cocoa by pressing out part of the butter in 1868. Growing popularity of cacao preparations. The incidence of import duties did not prevent the continuous increase in the amount of cacao consumed in the British Isles. When Queen Victoria came to the throne, the cacao cleared for home consumption was about 4,000 or 5,000 tons, more than half of which was consumed by the Navy. At the time of Queen Victoria's death it had increased to 4 times this amount, and by 1915 it had reached nearly 50,000 tons. End of chapter 1.